Hi everyone, and welcome to the Imagining a New We video blog with me, Dr. Samantha Catrera, a video blog designed to help history teachers and other history educators teach history in ways that are more meaningful, transformative, and inclusive for their students. This week's video is a part 2 on the purposes of teaching history. Last week, not last week, I'm in the same outfit. The last video talked about some prompts for reflecting on what your purpose and what your visions are for teaching. And this one is a quick B.Ed Curriculum 101 debrief about some orientations to teaching and learning that might help you think more about what you gravitate towards, what you might need to become even more effective educators in your classroom. If you aren't a classroom teacher, if you teach history in museums or archives or community sites, this is still useful for you. As I said in the last video in part 1 of this, one of my favorite articles about teaching and learning history is one that said that teachers teach with a purpose that they defined before becoming a history teacher. So even if they learned a particular set of skills or practices in their Bachelor of Education, they already have an idea in their head of how they want to teach. And so they teach in those ways. And hopefully those are great ways. I have yet to meet too many history teachers that aren't teaching in really creative and awesome ways. What I want to introduce today is a orientation to curriculum that I still find useful almost 20 years after the fact of being introduced to these ideas. And that is the 3 curriculum perspectives or orientations that are outlined in this book by John Miller and Wayne Seller. You might be familiar with it yourself in your Bachelor of Education. What is so great about this book is that they identify that there are 3 orientations to curriculum, and I would also argue teaching. So curriculum is the both stated and unstated expectations of what we do in our classroom. Teaching is actually doing that. So those 3 perspectives are transmission, transaction, and transformation. Those 3 perspectives really frame a lot of how people come to education. So in this video, I'm going to outline what those 3 things are really briefly and advocate for what I think that we should be moving towards for history education as a way to help maybe broaden what we can think about what we can do in the classroom. So the first one is transmission. It is telling students stuff. It is just transmitting information. It is rote learning. If you are familiar with Paulo Freire, it is depositing information into students' heads. It is a very traditional way of teaching and learning. And what is so funny about history education, and I say funny in a very ironic way, what is so funny about history education is that that's what a lot of people expect from national history education, and that's what many people think actually happen in our classrooms, that we are just standing in front of the classroom and lecturing. We are just transmitting information to our students. And maybe we are in some of those classrooms, but in a lot of classrooms we aren't. And even if we are, I think we all kind of know that this transmission form of teaching is not the best way for students to learn. They're not just there to be because they're blank slates or to have information dumped in their heads. They are there to be more active in learning. And that is how we can think about our second perspective, which is transaction. The transaction orientation is a more lower L liberal, pragmatic approach to history education. The transaction approach is that teaching and learning is a transaction between teacher and student. It's a dialogue that goes back and forth. It is learning the not constraints, but is learning the boundaries of problem solving, and through this kind of talking and acting approach, the student would figure out the things that they need to learn. This is a very Dewey way of approaching education. And again, it's from this kind of liberal, lower L liberal approach of that there is ways that we can come to understand, we can come to reason, we can come to think through things through this transaction approach. The historical thinking approach to history education really fits in this transaction approach because it's about problem solving, it's about the discipline of history, it's about this discussion back and forth of questions that you have about inquiring about history and using primary sources and doing. This is the transaction approach to history education. The third approach is the transformative approach to education. And this transformative approach is based on a romantic kind of notion of teaching and learning according to Miller and Sellers, but it's also on a very critical approach to education, and not critical like angry, but critical as in a more social justice approach. So it is an integrative approach to teaching and learning. It's ways that focus on the intersections of things like structural inequity. It wants or believes that history education or any education is there to transform the student, to be able to transform them into someone that can do and be in a world that is better and more just. And so the transformation approach is one that allows for a greater critical exploration of ideas, for students to be able to come to know and learn in ways that are more integrated and more intersectional than just, for example, problem solving alone or sitting and listening alone. So a transaction or a transmissive approach to education. My approach to education is transformative all the way. I feel like the goal of history education should help students create this really cool foundation for understanding what has come before and understanding the possibilities of what could come in the future. For me, it's really about imagining this new vision of what we could be in the future by understanding things like resistance in the past, resilience in the past, people's experiences in the past that we can draw inspiration from. So when I look at those three perspectives, I see myself very clearly in one of them. I see myself in the transformative approach. And while the transaction approach, the historical thinking approach to history education is very prominent right now, and any, as you probably know, any revision to the Canadian history curriculum across the provinces and territories that was done after 2007 really are drawn to the historical thinking approach, I actually see that there's a lot of limitations to that, and I've written and talked about that a lot, because I think that if we're just focusing on problem solving through a particular method, we're not giving students necessarily the tools and ideas to help challenge a structural approach to the world that is often very difficult for a lot of people, because the world is patriarchal, the world is racist generally, the world right now has issues with climate change and climate justice that we need to approach in really aggressive and empowered ways. And so I think that we should think about history education in transformative ways. What do you think that we should be doing with history education? What do you see the promise of history education being? What do you see the practicalities of what you can do in your class? And how can we have greater conversations about ways to make these orientations even stronger and better and more explicit for our students? Click the link below to go to a page that has a lot of really great resources about this topic that I'm talking about, as well as a link to the other video about the purpose of teaching education and how we can reflect on that a little bit more. I really look forward to seeing you next week in a different outfit, because that's what you do when you make a video every week. And I can't wait to hear what you think that your own orientation to curriculum is. Feel free to make a link in the comments or email me directly. And have a great week, everyone.